Hello and welcome everyone to Governing Intimacies in Lockdown. My name is Srila Roy and I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at Wits University, where I also lead a research project funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, which is called Governing Intimacies. So this webinar series basically continues the research, the collaborations, the conversations that we've had on the project to do with governance, politics, sexuality, gender, and obviously intimacies in the Global South, specifically looking at India and South Africa. So we decided to kickstart the series by looking at the idea of home within and beyond pandemic times. And today we're talking about revolutions. I mean, on the one hand, it seems that revolutionary possibilities are entirely mitigated by the current conditions, whether to do with isolation and distancing. But at the same time, obviously, we've all seen in this very moment massive uprisings, popular uprisings, often at an unprecedented scale, like in the US, and the continuation of popular struggles, which happened before the pandemic and are continued in its course and after. And I'm thinking particularly of places like India and Lebanon, which are facing enormous challenges as we speak. So today we're talking about revolution, and we're talking about revolution in the realm of the intimate, in the everyday, and we've got two wonderful historians with us who are also going to help us to think through past revolutionary events, experiences and subjectivities, and how they might inform the way we think of the present moment, which feels often like, at least to me, like an endless present. So I'm going to introduce our speakers to you in a minute, but I want to first introduce my colleague, Nehama Brody, who's a South African journalist and is also our first PhD on the Governing Intimacies Project. Nehama is going to be doing the gathering your questions today. So please use the Q&A button. You can start straight away if you have some questions to keep them coming. And then Nehama is going to sort of put them together, serve them up to our speakers. Thanks so much, Nehama. Our speakers today are Professor Aparna Vaidik and Dr. Caio Araujo. Professor Vaidik is an associate professor of history at Ashoka University. Ashoka University is actually our partner institution in India, and Aparna is a grantee of the Governing Intimacies Project. Aparna has written work both fiction and non-fiction, and today she's going to talk about she's going to draw on her forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press, which is called Waiting for Swaraj, Lives of Indian Revolutionaries. And indeed, she has another book coming quite soon, which is also on the same theme. So welcome, Aparna. Thank you so much for being here today. Caio Araujo is also a grantee of the Governing Intimacies Project, and he's currently at Wits in collaboration with the Gay and Lesbian Archives, which is based here in South Africa, and it's also called Gala. He's leading an oral history project on the intimate lives of queer communities in Mozambique, and the project is called Archives of the Intimate: Queer Histories of Mozambique. And Caio is also a historian on looking specifically at Afro-Asian and decolonizations, and that's what he's going to be talking about. Okay, so both speakers are going to speak to the central theme for 10 minutes each, after which they're going to have an opportunity to speak to one another, moderated by myself, and then we're going to open up to questions. So thanks so much for being here, for joining in, and I'll ask Aparna to kick us off, please. Thanks, Aparna. Oh, Aparna, you're muted. It wouldn't be a webinar unless someone said that.
I know,
right?
I know.
You're muted, Aparna.
So thank you, Srila, for the introduction. And my computer also speaks on its own, so it's going to speak at some point. So yeah. So I want to just begin by thanking the Governing Intimacies Project for the grant. It came at a time that I really, really needed it. So I was able to finish the manuscript and send it off. So thank you for that. And so just a little bit about my work before I speak to the Governing Intimacies theme. Now, this is part of a larger project on history of revolutionism in 1920s in India. And I'm looking at two revolutionary organizations. And this is just for so that to clue in the listeners. One is the Hindustan Republican Association, which is HRA, and the other one has an S in it, HSRA, Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. Yeah. So HRA and HSRA is what I work on. And the revolutionaries associated with them are pretty famous in the popular domain. So people like Chandrasekhar Azad, Ram Prasad Bismil, Sachinnath Sanyal, and Bhagat Singh, of course, Rajguru, Sukhdev, and all those. So these are the people it's their lives that I've been looking at for past few years. Now, so the larger question that I'm looking at is of revolutionary ontology. And Caio is also going to speak to that. And let's hope we don't give you the same answers. So the question I was asking about revolutionary ontology was, so what makes these people believe that they were revolutionaries? When does a person say, I am a revolutionary? And this question becomes pertinent because I'm fundamentally studying revolutionaries without a revolution. These people who are calling themselves revolutionaries, but there was no revolution here. Nothing happened. So how does one write history of people who call themselves revolutionaries, but did not have a revolution to go with it? Thank you for that, Linda. Another thing why this question is pertinent is that in South Asian historiography, revolutionism is not the most obvious or natural framework. Like if you study Latin American history or you study Russian history, or for that matter, even European history, revolution is a word that's thrown in easily and it has its own sort of connotations attached with it. And it's assumed to be okay to be using that word. Now in South Asian historiography, revolution is not something that you come by easily. Yeah. So at the end, I will also speak to that what does this studying the revolutionary ontology, how does it connect up with historiography or the way we write history? So for today's talk, going back to the question of intimacy, what use is the lens of intimacy? What does it do for us? What value does it bring when examining history of revolution? And intimacy, can be understood in a variety of ways. We were just joking that so many people logged in because they think we are going to be talking about sex. But intimacy, the word I'm going to use is inner lives. So now inner lives is something that has been studied a great deal, especially in the feminist historiography of South Asia. And they have primarily studied lives of women through this lens. And where the quotidian, the everyday, the inner lives become a space of resistance. It is seen as embodying resistance. So, that's just the feminist historiography. And also they break this, there are several strains in it. They break the division between private and public. They bring to fore the idea of personal is political and all of that. Now, drawing on that, when you use this framework for the revolutionary history, how has it been used? Now, you have work on several female revolutionaries. Srila's own work, Kavita Punjabi, Mallika Roy Sinha, Geraldine Forbes, Durga Ghosh has an article, and Kama McLean has an article on Durga Bhari. So female revolutionaries' lives have been studied through the lens of inner lives. So that's valuable for us. And recently there is a book by Anya Lumba called Revolutionary Desires. Now, Anya Lumba makes a slightly different point than the other historians. And what she says is that in the communist and the labor movement, the everyday domestic and emotional lives of the communist women. So going back to Anya Lumba. So, so she's saying that inner lives have not been interrogated enough when it comes to female revolutionaries. Now, where does my work come in? Now, missing in the historiography are inner lives of male revolutionaries. And the question I ask is why? Why so? Why are they not there? Why don't we bother using this lens to interrogate their lives? Now, the answer is pretty simple, actually. Now, most of these male revolutionaries, also known as active or professional revolutionaries, left homes and their families behind when they came into the revolutionary movement. Very few of them were actually married. And the ones who married actually became adults instead of active revolutionaries. So leaving behind homes and families detach the inner lives frame from their lives, from their political lives, so to say. So that's why people thought, oh, it's not of consequence much. What we really need to look at is their political actions. Second reason is a gendered notion of space. Now, lived and familial or quotidian lives, got it, 5 minutes, lived or quotidian lives are seen as feminine. They're presumed to be feminine and therefore seen as politically inconsequential. Although that's not true, but they're seen as politically inconsequential and therefore not worthy of study. The third reason is revolutionaries' actions and the idea of revolution is seen as, is associated with or is connected with the idea of event. Now, once you do that, then what you are focusing on are the sensational, awe-inspiring, and heroic events, which are masculinized. So, and when it is seen as such, then it's the masculine action that becomes politically consequential and therefore worthy of study. So what we end up doing is we study the revolutionaries when they throw a bomb or they kill someone or they loot a train or something. So those become the things that you study. Fourth is when you're studying male revolutionaries, one is focusing on ideology. One is focusing on ideas because men do ideas and women do dishes. So, okay, I'm just being facetious. So there is a search for intellectual and lofty ideas as opposed to the mundane. The inner life, the quotidian life, the everyday, stuff that people do is for women. Yeah. So very quickly, what does inner lives do for us when studying these male revolutionaries? What is it that I was able to pull out? Just so quick, 3 things I was able to pull out. One, it refocused the historian's attention on praxis. And I argue in my work that praxis is the fount of revolutionary ontology. If you want to understand revolutionary ontology, you have to shift your attention away from the visible moments of action and onto praxis. And here I use, practice theory, social production of human beings, that production of revolutionaries through social action in the world and in turn, production of the world through social actions. So praxis becomes very important. And in fact, praxis becomes the fount of ontology and also of ideology. So ideology is not simply ideas out there, but ideas as they're worked out in practice. The second takeaway for us is it helps us rethink the idea of revolution, where revolution is not simply an event. Revolution is as you live. So the idea of revolution is actually transacted at the level of every day. So for a revolutionary to be a revolutionary or to say I am a revolutionary, they have to live like a revolutionary. The inner lives, the inner selves, the underground lives become a microcosm of the party that they imagine. The freedom that they imagine politically becomes in the inner world, the freedom over self. So Swaraj has political connotations, but it also has inner personal connotations for them. Yeah. The third thing it does for us is, and this is strictly speaking about South Asian revolutionaries and the ones I'm looking at, because these patterns can differ in different other places and with other material. It helps us unpack the idea of failure. Because I feel this idea of fail or lack, failed histories or histories that are lack, that didn't succeed, has come to attach itself or has come to be associated with Indian revolutionism. It is seen as a failed ideology, an ideology that it could not bring India to freedom. So I feel that looking at the inner lives actually helps us interrogate this idea of failure. And since I have only 1 minute, I shall stop here and give it to Caio.
Great. Okay. I mean, I'm already, thinking of a lot of things that we can all talk about, but Caio, go for it.
Yeah.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Aparna, Srila, and everyone. This is such an amazing articulation of ideas. And for me, it has been particularly productive to revisit this issue of revolution, given the moment we are living right now, where, you know, people were throwing around words such as unprecedented, historic, earth-shaking, and things like that. And I feel like the popular vocabulary used to refer to COVID has a little bit of this language of revolution, like we are experiencing a revolutionary moment, a moment of rupture, of historical change. Of course, as historians, we are a bit suspicious when people start talking about, you know, we are living a revolution, we are living a moment of change, because we've seen time and time again in history, generations of the past living these moments of crisis, of change, of opportunities, which are moments that are not necessarily leading to revolutionary change. At the same time, as Srila was saying in the beginning, we cannot overlook the popular politics of protest going on during the pandemic, where protest has been going on even under lockdown, under social distancing protocols, especially after the killing of George Floyd. Especially because my topic deals a little bit with the histories of anti-racism and of movements for decolonization, which are movements that are still going on. This period of the pandemic has been productive because the way in which the health crisis is being dealt with is exposing a lot of the living legacies of colonialism in our present, and obviously of structural racism. So the context of the pandemic is giving us a lot to think about. And in my case, especially as a historian of Afro-Asian anti-colonial movements in the 60s and 70s, which were decades of revolution by excellence, decades in which, you know, the world was being remade after the fall of empires. I think I've been thinking a lot about these issues of historical change and of political change. And for me, what is most interesting about this decolonization era is that it was a time of endless possibility and very high aspirations for change. And in a variety of agendas, for example, from colonialism, racism, global inequalities, and things like that. As I said, a lot of these struggles are still ongoing. So with that in mind, and after listening to Aparna's presentation, I would also like to raise 3 issues before we go to the debate and questions. The first issue has to do also with the ways in which we think about and write about revolutions as these highly public affairs. And I think, you know, when most people are thinking about these revolutionary moments, they tend to think about this kind of highly publicized moments with multitudes taking the streets and things like that. And the historical literature on decolonization in particular has conventionally tended to focus on this particular aspect of a revolutionary process, which takes place on the streets, on the battlefield, at a negotiation table. So in this model of historical narrative, the public space is the space of political change, and the home is the space of domesticity and reproduction. So much in tune with what Aparna was just saying right now. So the street is a revolutionary space, and the home is a conservative space. Of course, feminism scholarship and queer scholarship also have been emphasizing that spaces of intimacy, desire, and domesticity can also be revolutionary. And we know about that now. So, but I still think that this is an area in which we as historians still have a lot of work to do, especially about this moment of the 60s and 70s. My second point is that also, you know, like as Aparna was just saying, revolutions have also been conventionally thought of as events and as markers. So you have a marker in a linear history, which is very often a national history. And I want to suggest instead that we think of revolutions as a sensibility. And I say that because what I think is particularly interesting about revolutionary moments is that they produce, or rather they exist in a kind of suspension of historical linearity. There is a shift in subjectivity, and there is this lived experience of historical rupture. So I'm drawing here on several authors writing in the philosophy of history, for example, Koselleck, who are arguing that people's experiences of historical time are based on the experience of a past and of a present and a certain imagination of the future. So those two things brought together, that's what produced the experience of historical time. In a revolutionary moment, this coupling of past and future is kind of subverted. We know the revolutionary moments are moments in which pasts are being rewritten, in which futures are being reimagined. So there is there is a disjunction between several competing projects, and I think that's what makes revolutionary moments so rich historiographically. So I'm trying to think of these moments as something that is lived, and of revolutions as the sense of feeling historical, as James Clifford has argued, a visceral awareness of a given world suddenly gone. So I think both the ideas of domesticity and of viscerality, they open up a space for us to think of revolutions differently. The third point that I also think it's quite interesting and important when we think about the revolutions of the 60s and 70s is the aspect of transnationality. Especially in terms of Afro-Asian decolonizations, which were highly transnational projects embodied in a number of conferences, committees, and solidarity campaigns. This aspect of solidarity, again, is living with us today, you know, with the global reach of movements such as Black Lives Matter and other movements like that. So, and speaking about my particular research, I'm interested on India's support to liberation movements in Africa, in this idea of Afro-Asian liberation. So I wanted to give one example of a particular program that I find quite interesting, which was a program that the Indian government launched in the 1950s, which was a scholarship program for African students. And again, the program had two perspectives. First, to create the field of study, African studies in India, as part of this kind of epistemic shift of how can we learn about the African continent, and then kind of fostering closer relationships. And secondly, the movement of students itself, it was embedded in this Afro-Asian politics of liberation. Now, what I find especially interesting, and again, as Aparna just spoke about failure, is that, again, this is a program that failed. And it failed because, and that's what I find especially interesting, because you have a movement of change and then the resistance of reaction. So a lot of the more radical aspirations regarding this project of closer Afro-Asian partnership and dialogue were in the end curtailed by things such as bureaucracy, institutional conservatism, and things like that. And I think these histories are very important to revisit today, especially when we want to encourage more of these Afro-Asian dialogues, which this series is an example of. So I think I'll stop here and we can move to comments.
Excellent timing.
Thank you so much. Okay, that's good because because the timing. Oh, sorry. Am I unmute? Is someone going to tell me that I have to unmute myself? No. Oh, good, great. Thank you. So thank you so much, and that was so precise and so well timed. And I'm going to say something really quickly, and then I'm sure you have lots to say to one another, and then we'll open it up to Q&A because I can see all the questions are coming. And thank you so much for presenting your questions already. So I just wanted to say two quick things. So one, I was thinking in terms of scale. So I was thinking, obviously, how, thinking of or moving away from the analytics of rupture and the event to the everyday is obviously a scale shifting strategy when we think of revolutions. And that in a way is something that is kind of established now, right? To think of revolutions as not just as a break from the everyday, but being continuous to, or indeed, reimagining or reconfiguring the everyday itself. And Aparna, you're right. I think the feminist scholarship has really been on point here. But I was thinking what's more interesting in what you've both said is also how these shifting scales then involve a transformation of self. And of course, I was very struck by that in my own work on the Naxalites, which is, obviously, one of the major slogans appropriated from the Maoists was change yourself, change the world, right? So the self is really the scale at which transformation is imagined and begins. And yet I feel that in not only in our context, in the post-colony, but I think more generally, if I think of feminist politics, for instance, there is a slight suspicion that the self is not enough of the site of transformation, right? The revolution has to be imagined as the collective. It can't just be about changing the self. And I'm just curious what you think about that. And just very finally about failure. And obviously I'm thinking about the work of Jack Haberstam and thinking of like the ambivalent gifts of failure, right? And while that's eloquent and moving and indeed generative, I'm thinking in your own actual work in these historical periods, have you seen failure as being generative in that sense? So, and I'll just stop there. And you don't have to respond to this. These are just ideas, and you can absolutely just speak to each other about other things that came to mind. Aparna, would you like to go first?
Yeah, it's strange, these webinar formats leave you very little time to think about, and these are great things for us to think about actually. And so I'll respond briefly, because I don't have well worked out thoughts on these. Now, questions of scale is definitely important. That's one thing I struggled with. How am I going to tell the story, like at the level of narrating the story, at the level of analyzing the story, and also the scales that the revolutionaries were negotiating. The scales of resistance, or the scales of, and where the self gets enmeshed in those scales. Because these 1920s is the time in India when this is post-Bolshevik revolution, socialist literatures begin to flow in. And reading that literature is making them imagine new sorts of affective communities. Yeah. However, they are not really participating in any of these revolutionaries in particular, in any of the transnational revolutionary movements, but they're imagining themselves as part of them. Yeah. So for me, then the question of scale became important. That is this a global movement that we are looking at, or is it a local movement, or shall I, when I'm narrating the story, is it really about the self? So yeah, so the question of scale is definitely very important. And the moment you reduce the scale, your story becomes irrelevant. In so to say, because it then becomes an individualized local story that has no connection to the meta-narrative. So, so yeah, the question of scale is definitely important. And that's where I think flows into the second thing that you said about the self falling short. It's not only the collective that is important, but it is also the international connections, the globality, and all that goes with it. All that goes with an expanded scale, that becomes important in that moment. And the self then becomes so small and insignificant. And that's interesting because it presents us with a paradox. because it's the self that get annihilates in both. When you reduce this, when you expand the scale, the self gets invisibilized, but the revolutionary is also the one who gets annihilated. He's the one who's supposed to die. So annihilation itself is also a prerequisite here. You see, and that's the paradox I'm talking about. That, you know, like in the way I distinguish between revolutionary is somebody who's willing to die. Not that nationalist leaders were not willing to die, but this one was for death awaited them. It was an ever-present reality in a way that wasn't for a Gandhian satyagraha. Yeah. So annihilation of self was something, or covenant with death was something they have to have made, or they have to have believed that they have made when they become revolutionaries, or when they say I am a revolutionary. Yeah, so annihilation of self is the precondition. But in the scale of things, when you reduce it to the self, from global to local to self, then the self becomes invisibilized, which is like a paradox for historical inquiry. And quickly about failure as a generative force, maybe, you know, I'll let Caio speak. I can come back to this.
Caio? And thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Yeah, I think on the issue of revolution as opposed, you know, the kind of tension between change and continuity, what I find particularly productive on this issue, and I was very interested on Aparna's formulation about the people who are in waiting. And I think that is absolutely right, because the experience of change doesn't have to be an actual experience of change. It can be the expectation of sudden change. And I think a lot of these movements, they are happening around the expectation of change. And sometimes you do have the lived reality of change, but you always have the expectation of change. And I was really trying to think around this experience of expectation, of thinking that something is about to change and should change drastically. And I think that is something, especially, you know, if we're looking to especially late colonial period, because the late colonial period is a period in which people know that the system is falling. So they know there is a world that is coming to an end. Sometimes they try to to prevent it, but they know that it's ending. So I'm very interested in this period as an experience, and that's why I was talking about revolution as an experience. And I also think that the emphasis on the revolutionary subject that we have in the literature, that is something that I was having a little bit of trouble with. And I found fascinating that Aparna spoke of doing a research on revolutionaries without a revolution, because I find I'm very prone to do the opposite, the study of a revolution without revolutionaries. So not only, you know, I'm not so much interested in people who think they are revolutionaries and what they do on the everyday, but also on the people who do not think of themselves as revolutionaries, but are living through a revolutionary moment. How is that affecting experiences of the self, imaginations of a community, imaginations of the future? I think those are quite important questions, especially because histories of liberation, decolonization, of nation building, they kind of have been hijacked by liberation movements. What happened to the experiences of the people who are not part of those movements, or who are not part of the particular struggle, but still lived through that process? So I'm very interested on this, on these tensions, on this plurality of experience. And I think to Aparna, I wanted to ask, there are so many questions that I had, but I wanted to ask you, because I know from your work that you have quite interesting thoughts about the issue of the sources and of the archive, and I'm very much interested in thinking about history writing and historical research in relation to the archive, because this kind of history that we talk about, the revolution as an event, the revolution as a kind of a masculine moment, it is kind of produced by the archive, because these are the sources that are readily available. So I have two questions. First is, how do we explore other sources? And can we read this kind of very public, very eventful, very masculine reservoir of sources in the archives, but read them against the grain? Find the intimacy in these kinds of conventional sources. And I find this movement of trying to read them differently quite fruitful, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
But before that, can we take all the questions? Because there are a lot and they're great. Nehama, do you want to just get?
I do, and I'm also sad because I have a whole queue of questions that I also would really love to ask. I'm so intrigued by this notion of masculinity and femininity in terms of what we do and don't study. And as someone who works a lot with archives, the fact that these masculine actions are what tend to be documented. So when we study revolutions in retrospect, we have access to speeches and to manifestos, but we don't have access to their inner lives and to their conversations, which is often so much skews the way we approach it. But yes, we have a queuing number of questions. So I'm going to start, spoiled for choice. Just a reminder to everybody who's watching this that you can post your questions in the Q&A section, please, so that we don't lose them. Aparna's also already addressed a couple of the earlier questions that came through. I wanted to go to one of them, though, that was posted, which was, the question is, how do we think through the romanticization of a revolution without forgetting the deaths that are inherent in revolutions? And we've spoken about revolutions in a fairly abstract way. It's, that distance that history provides us. But even if a revolution has failed, it does often involve violence. And that violence could be public or it could be private. So I think maybe I'll start, Caio, with you, is also looking particularly in the context of Mozambique, which is a little bit more contemporary. And then to Aparna is, how do we work through or think through this romanticized, this nostalgic notion of revolution without forgetting the violence and the death? You need to unmute yourself, Caio, please.
I am so sorry. What I find interesting in talking about revolutions in the 1960s and 70s is that it was a very revolutionary moment, as we know, but revolution was not the only repertoire of collective action on the table. So this was also, I like to think of the historical moment as the moment of Afro-Asian revolutions, but it was also the moment of the Cold War. And being the moment of the Cold War, revolution was an alternative on the table. And then the other alternative was Western style development. So the aid industry is being set up more or less on the same period. And a lot of the debate around those issues about the root of revolution and the root of violence, or the root of organic change, or the root of development, were touching on those issues of death, destruction, and things like that. And also on the issue of history, because basically the argument that was on the table at the time, and it was an argument that one would hear in places like, the United Nations General Assembly, is that you don't need revolution, you need aid, you need technical assistance, you need things like that, you need nation building. So this idea of setting up countries in Africa and Asia for independence through this kind of slow change motions. Obviously, what happens as the decade progresses is that these kinds of projects of slow change motions through development and aid, they fail. They don't produce the change, the social and political change at the rate that people wanted. So I think the 1960 is a kind of turning point, and is a turning point to armed struggle. Throughout Southern Africa, there's plenty of studies about this kinds of early 60s as this major moment turning to armed struggle. And I think a lot of it has to do with, well, obviously there are several local historical issues that, there's no time to give details here, but I think a lot of it has to do with a certain inadequacy of reform as opposed to revolution. So, and the issues of the revolutionary moment as a moment of rupture, of death and destruction, I think it remains, but also a moment of possibility. And I think that's what we must keep in mind of revolution, not as something, because for me, the romanticization of revolutions in terms of national histories, they fall under a judgmental value of revolutions being good or bad. And I think it's more productive not to try to think of revolutions as good or bad, as destructive or constructive, but as moments of change. And I think, yeah, that's how I would answer to this question.
Aparna?
Okay, I think these are two separate questions of how not to write romantic histories of revolution. And the other question is, how do we understand violence? What do we do with violence? So I will just tackle them a little, I'll tackle them separately. So, I think that question is spot on when you're saying we romanticize violence. We do that, especially in South Asian historiography, because revolution is so hard to come by. So whenever you do get it, you tend to romanticize. So a little bit of that is there. And also this, this whole thing of revolution is going and killing and bombing, it's all very cool. So, so it goes in, that romanticization is there. But I think the problem is not with revolutions being romanticized, but the problem actually stems from what, Manu Goswami uses this term, methodological nationalism. That, we have had generations of scholars, post-colonial historiography, subaltern, this and that, postmodern, that has critiqued nationalism or the nationalist enterprise. But we continue to reproduce it in the way we produce history. And that's what is methodological nationalism. So we really tend to focus on, we tend to celebrate. All writings on nationalist resistance tend somewhere to celebrate resistance. It's not just revolution that gets romanticized, it's resistance that gets romanticized. Yeah, and that's the product of methodological nationalism. And this is a question that I've been tackling because these guys are so cool. Spending time with the revolutionaries, the way they write, is like all your fantasies are there in their writings. All the things that cloistered women cannot do, you read those books and you can make those journeys in your mind with them. Okay, so how not to romanticize? That was a question for me when I started work on the revolutionaries. And I think that led me towards looking at histories of renegades, because they are thought of as collaborators. And how many histories of collaboration? You have histories of collaboration, or you have, and which appear as this Jagat Seth who supported the British, gave them money or something. But how many histories of collaborators are out there? They're still not seen as worthy of study. Yeah, and the very word collaboration embodies a sort of a pejorative meaning. Yeah, so the idea was to start looking at renegades. Who are the people who went to court and testified against a hero like Bhagat Singh? How do I tell that story? Is that story accessible to me? And when I tell it, how not to get everybody angry with me? Because, all of that. So that's one way of going around this whole thing of romanticization. Another is to see the revolutionaries as flawed, incomplete individuals, like all of us are. You know, this whole idea of martyrdom and seeing them as sons of Mother India and all of that fundamentally leads us into a romanticization. You will not see elements of their personality or their writings that don't go along with this idea. And this I say because I found one revolutionary leader, Sukhdev, who was hanged along with Bhagat Singh. I actually found vast evidence of him having become a police informer. Yeah, or having informed or given out information, not informer in terms of hired informer, but having given out information to the police about hideouts, about other people when he was arrested. Now, what happened when I first found that, first started reading this material, I was in complete denial. I was in complete denial, and I was working with this another Australian historian, Kama McLean, and Kama said, Aparna, you can keep denying it, but there is evidence. And you know what my response was? Kama is Australian, she doesn't care about India. I was being so nationalistic at that moment. And that's where I realized my own methodological nationalism. This story is there, it's there in the archive, I can continue denying it. And there's, you know, so romanticization is a product of, and it's more prominent in people post-colonial societies. We need heroes. Yeah, so that's the thing. So see the ambivalence, see the gray areas. They are not perfect human beings, they're imperfect. Let's talk about the imperfection because that tells us more about them than they being perfect individuals. Now, about how do we understand violence, or this question of violence and revolution. Now, the presumption in this question is that revolutions are fundamentally about violence. Yeah, as if revolutions are these seismic events, you know, where the entire world is turned upside down, everything is breaking, everything's falling apart, there is dust, there are soldiers on the horses, you know, with guns and all that, trying to control people, or people, you know, storming the Bastille, you know, those are the imageries associated with revolution. But revolution, as Caio said, can be a sensibility. Revolution can also be a process. Revolution is, you know, so it can be a variety of things. So I feel that it's reductive to associate revolution simply with violence, but that doesn't mean that we can dissociate it with violence entirely. But another way of looking at it can be, are other forms of resistance without violence? Why do we attach only revolutions with violence? Other forms of resistance can be also violent. And one of the sort of entry points that I used to think about violence in relation to the revolutionaries was to think of how do they think of violence? What is their imagination of violence? And their imagination of violence is they actually see it as a temporal tool. And now what does it mean that they see it as a temporal tool? They see it as a way of shortening time, distance to their utopia. So it's not that they're fundamentally wedded to violence or care about violence. It's serving a purpose. Yeah, so I think I'll stop here. And I really like Caio's thing about the archive, but if we have time, I would respond to that and engage with that.
I think it would be great to actually maybe talk a little bit more about the archive, and I want to move the kind of questions in a particular way. I want to do one more question that looks at the sort of the inner life, the intimate space, and then also then move on to something that explores the timeline of revolutions, that situates it in the contemporary, but also looks at the afterlives and the duration or the long-term effects of revolution. But I'm going to get there. The question that I wanted to ask is linked. It's been submitted to us in the Q&A section, but it also relates to notes that I've taken from both of your talks and also from your papers that you're talking about, is this connection between, so the question is, can you expand on the connection between intimacy and failure or lack? And also, what is the political value or effect of acknowledging failure? And I was listening to both of you and thinking, when we discuss this notion of failure in the context of a revolution, is it a failure of the self, of the individual, or is it a failure of the revolution? And what are the consequences of either labeling or acknowledging that something has failed? I suppose we'd have to also say, how do we even determine whether something has failed? Aparna, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Caio?
You know, it's like a rapid fire question. So, who does the failure belong to? So, I think the failure at, the first step answer to this question for me would be the failure is what the historiography constructs. So the failure is a historiographical one, more than a real one. And it's historiographical because historians see it as failure, or later writers, not just historians, later writers see revolutionism as a failure, or they also fail themselves in seeing it for what it is. So this failure is double-sided. It's a historiographical failure which fails to accord something legitimacy or to see it only in terms of having succeeded in a particular way. And that's the historiography's failure as well. Yeah. But if I were to ask, how do the revolutionaries see this? Do they see themselves as having failed? Yeah. I think then the answer would be, they could only succeed if they failed. Their success lay in their failure if we understood failure as them dying instead of bringing about the revolution. Because they actually saw themselves as a long chain of warriors who would keep coming back. So the ones in 1920s were not just belonging to 1920s, they saw themselves as going back to 1857. And because they will always keep coming back, we are still talking about revolution. You see so many posters of Bhagat Singh which says, "Dobara aana padega kya? Will I have to return again?" Yeah, because these are heroes who will keep returning. They never die. They die, but they never die. Yeah,
that's such a great concept.
Yeah, and that's how they get immortalized. Yeah, so that's one. And then how do revolutionaries actually see it? What do they see as having failed? So they never see themselves as having failed. They see time as having failed them. So post-colonial revolutionaries, they have one Swaraj, they have one independence. Yeah, but the independence they imagined never came. So what failed was the time, not them. They will keep returning. Their project remains unfinished. So they don't fail. So we can take out failure from their histories.
Caio, when there's so many things to unpack there, and also it might sound like a particular notion in terms of Indian history, but has strong resonance with Southern African history and the history of revolutionaries going back generations, where the names of heroes get brought up again. So Caio, back to you again. When you spoke in your talk about this notion of failure, what does it represent for you? I don't know if you want to respond to Aparna or continue with, from where you started speaking.
No, I completely agree with Aparna's answer in the sense that failure here is a historiographical one. So, and especially I think when we're talking about these moments of change, which are very rich moments and are moments in which, and that's when I'm thinking about revolution as an experience and about a subjectivity, I'm especially interested on how people had all these projects, all these ideas, going on simultaneously. And I think when we look at these moments and we look at the complexity and then the outcomes of the complexity, they end up being, they go through this process of reduction, which is produced again by nationalist history, as Aparna was mentioning. So in my particular case, I've been very interested on studying failed histories, which means histories of things that have never happened, or things that were projects that never came through fruition. So, and I think that is something of a trend in histories of the colonization and of the global South. There are a lot of people looking at these processes that were in the making but never made it to the end. And I think those are, so here we have a window of opportunity to understand how history could have been otherwise. So what, for example, in the case of Mozambican revolution, what people like Benedito Machava have called the roads not taken, you know, in these kinds of revolutionary processes. And I think those are examples of how this notion of failure in historical writing can be very productive.
So much to explore here. I want to move things on. We are closing in on 3 o'clock, but Srila, I'm going to suggest we continue, because if people can stay for an extra few minutes, that would be great. The question that I want to look at now, and I want to again link two concepts together that I think relate. So the question that was submitted via the Q&A asks, do the panelists have any thoughts on what the current world of social media contributes towards revolutionary movements? I'm thinking of all the people across the globe sitting at home and turning their profiles black as a way of claiming support for Black Lives Matter. It seems to me that this jumping onto a revolution by the click of a mouse minimizes the movement. So I want to pair that question. Does social media and the ability to jump onto a revolution with a click, does it minimize the support for movement? To pair that with this idea of what is the afterlife of a revolution? And this notion of revolutions that can regenerate themselves or reappear in future generations, how does this concept link through, if we're doing things online and through social media? I don't know, I'm not going to now put either of you on the spot. I don't know who wants to start, Caio or Aparna. I don't want to do the rapid fire thing. Who wants to speak first?
Aparna, would you like to?
Caio, I think you are looking at the present a lot more, no?
No,
Go ahead, then I will say something.
Yeah, I think the whole issue with social media and with our present moment, the way I look about it is there has been a kind of penetration of these revolutionary ideas and of revolutionary symbols and icons in popular culture in general. And I think this is something that has been going on for a very long time. But I think, you know, with the possibilities of social media, of internet and connectivity and all that, that has increased quite a lot. So I think revolutionary imagery in the end has gained this space in popular culture. And well, there's a very complex debate on commodification of those ideas. And I think that's what it boils down to in the end.
Before we go to Aparna, I wanted to ask, Aparna, I was reading through the chapters of your forthcoming book. And what interests me is your ability to look back into the past and to look at the conversations of revolutionaries. So you document their inner lives and their interactions between each other, which of course are not always the types of things that are recorded. So maybe is to add that on is when we discuss what is the impact of revolutionaries now living their lives out on social media, where we constantly see their conversations, and what is the difference between the experience of revolution when you're tweeting your thoughts and your conversations compared to the revolutionaries of the 1920s who are catching a train together or having a conversation together.
Okay, I'll try to answer, okay. I think the words that I think about when I'm thinking about social media radicalism, the important word for us to hold on to is performance. Social media is a performative act. And the performing presumes an audience. But here, the performance in itself becomes enough. So actually, it is disembodied in that way. When you're living in the underground, it's embodied. So what social media does, although it is creating a flow, it's creating a connectivity. it is also disembodying the revolution of it's also disembodying revolution and revolutionary ideas. And I think that's where the risk is. Yeah. And I think another important idea for us to hold on to is praxis. So, you know, praxis becomes performance on social media. And that becomes a sum total of what I'm going to call praxis for a person performing on social media. So, and that again reduces praxis to simply online performance. So you can actually go on living your lives, and what Caio said about commodification, it lends itself, once it's disembodied, you can commodify easily. Yeah, I can say what I want on online, I don't have to live it. Yeah. And so that would be my answer to about the social media warriors. Yeah.
That's such a great answer. I'm trying to type
I'm
it.
so elitist and condescending.
Always put it down. We can always put it to age, Aparna.
I was like this when I was younger also.
No, but this is a good discussion where, I mean, even, you know, my work looking at violence and intimacy questions the importance of hashtag protests as a solution against violence. And, you know, maybe we have enough distance to question it, but that it's a much bigger conversation. But it's a really important discussion. Is this a revolution? Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to briefly go back to Srila because we are slightly over our time. So Srila, I don't know if you want to continue with questions or if you want to round up.
I think we should round up, but I just really wanted, well, Aparna, just to respond very quickly to Caio's question around the archive. And I wanted Caio to maybe end by just saying something about Afro-Asian solidarity. I mean, we're talking a lot about, you know, protests happening today, and let's not forget the space of that is also, the scales are shrinking and shifting because of this revolution that we're in. And so I wanted Caio to maybe just end by taking us back to, to those solidarities and those futures. So Aparna, if you'd like to just, and thank you everyone. I'm sorry we're taking just a couple more minutes. So those of you who are staying on, thanks very much. And those of you who have to go, we totally get it.
Okay, so going to the question of archive. Now, revolutionaries don't exist in archives, at least in the national archives that we have. Revolutionaries' lives fundamentally defy archiving. So they come into the archive only when they throw a bomb, kill someone, they're put on a trial, or they're hanged, or some newspapers start talking about them. So they make an appearance as seditionists, anarchists, and as criminals. There is no revolutionary in the archive. Yeah, and this is what also generates a masculinized image of the archive. I think there is a few valuable articles that Kama McLean and Daniel Elam and Chris Moffat put together. So I would really recommend that as something people should read when they're thinking about revolutionaries and archives. Now, but we do have an archive that the revolutionaries generated. And that is their political pamphlets, their political writings, and their memoirs. Now, I distinguish between the two. Yeah, and the reason I distinguish between the two is I see one as the more visible form of writing, which is the political documents, pamphlets, posters, short bills that they would make and paste on on walls of the city and all that. Now, those were really for the public. It was to put the message out. So that was a coded way of reaching the public, and it was meant to be seen. It was meant to be intercepted and seen. Yeah. And the memoir is something that is written in hindsight. So a memoir is the one that actually documents their inner lives. Because you can't write without talking about the time that you spent together. It's not just ideas that moved your lives. It's what you had with each other that moved your lives. And the memoir is the easiest to miss out on and to set aside. And I did that for several years while working on the revolutionaries. I saw the memoirs as unimportant or used them only to mine them for information. What I could extract out of the memoir about the action that took place. Yeah? I never saw the memoirs as legitimate because they were supposed to be subjective. But then when my focus shifted to inner lives, and I was like, this was there, all there in front of my eyes all the time, but the refusal was a historiographical one. I was refusing to look at it as legitimate because in my mind, I was working again with the gendered perception. The inner world was irrelevant, it was feminized, it was not relevant to politics. It had nothing to do with them being revolutionaries. Yeah? So the elements of writings that you assume to have nothing to do with their lives are actually the most important pieces of writing that they left behind. So that way my entire work got sort of reconfigured, and I ended up focusing on the revolutionary memoirs. And I particularly focus on the Hindi memoirs of these revolutionaries. And they present a picture in stark contrast to the picture that you have of them in the political literature. Because looking at the political literature, you would think of them as simply socialists. People who were totally sorted, people who were to grow up. There was an inevitability in their becoming a revolutionary and the inevitability in their becoming Marxists. But if you look at their memoirs, that's not really the case. You see ambivalence, you see discord, you see internal dissension, and you see a heightened emotion about each other. So, okay, I'm going to stop here. Caio.
Okay, so in the idea, I think we have been living in the last decades or so, revival of the idea of Afro-Asian solidarity in academia and politics. There are many reasons for that, one of which is the anniversary of the Bandung conference. So there was a lot of scholarship on the Bandung moment and things like that on the Afro-Asian conferences of the 50s and 60s. But also the politics of our contemporary world with people from the Comoros to Boaventura de Souza Santos speaking about the rise of the global South, about India, Brazil, and South Africa as these powerhouses and things like that. So I think this kind of confidence in South-South relations revived the idea and the possibilities for change involved in the Afro-Asian idea. But I think in a very recent past, the kind of rise of the global right in the South is drastically curtailing the political potential of these ideas, unfortunately. So I think there is a space for movements and academia to keep working with this idea. Governing Intimacies is an example of that, because we really try to create this space of dialogue across India and South Africa. But those are I think those are positions that are under fire at the moment, and unfortunately so. And I think it's up to us to keep those alive.
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was obviously also thinking about the rise of BRICS and how that actually doesn't necessarily take forward our kind of future of what the solidarity should mean or to look like, but something quite different. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for everyone who stayed with us for just a couple of minutes more. We know everyone's time is precious, but this was too good an opportunity, I think, to not get our two speakers to say some final things. So thank you so much. So we're going to come back not next week, but the week after, where we have a session called Writing Women. We're going to be joined by my colleague at Wits University, Grace Musila, and Shireen Hasim, who was until recently also my colleague at Wits University, but now is in Carleton University in Canada. And these are two remarkable women who are going to talk about the lives of two other remarkable women in Southern Africa. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that publicity, sign up, and we'll see you on 19th August. God, that feels so awkward to say that. Like I'm like an anchor in some TV show, but I'm getting the hang of it. But thanks so much. And thank you so much, Caio, Aparna, Nihama, and Yurisha behind the scenes. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you. I had fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna. Thanks, Kai.
Dropped only once, so that was good.